Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Aaron, going very well, obviously in excitement, very excited for the ensuing federal budget this evening.
Yes, absolutely. But today we're going to focus our attention on property. Now, we do have a range of masterclasses throughout the year, and our next online SMSF masterclass using our Little Brewers Super Fund and our Malthouse family, we're going to be looking at the topic of property and the inclusion of limited recourse borrowing arrangements. So I guess over the next few weeks, we'll kind of set the scene a little bit as we unpack some property related topics that our attendees to that masterclass will get the opportunity to unpack further. But just for people who regularly listen to these weekly videos to get an understanding of some of the key issues around property and property related transactions within self-managed super funds. So I guess, Tim, today the topic is really around structural considerations, and I might get you to just start to highlight some of the key considerations here when we think about how we might structure up property when we utilize a self-managed super fund.
Yeah, no worries. So look, ultimately, what we see is you're going to have two types of holding, I guess, patterns as far as self-managed super funds and property are concerned. And that's going to be your direct property investment, where it may be outright or it may be as some form of tenants in common arrangement. And then you're going to have an indirect investment. Now, indirect becomes far more broader because you can talk about fractional property investments and unrelated property investments through large investment vehicles. But the most common one that we tend to speak about, particularly in the SMSF technical space, is investing via related entities, so primarily through a related unit trust. So we often then break down ultimately the way that we invest in property is as a direct one or indirect.
Yeah, and that can, I guess, go a step further as well, because quite often we might see kind of syndication of different unit holders where you spoke then about a related trust, and we're specifically looking at SIS Reg 13.22C, but it's not uncommon to see trust arrangements that don't fall under the auspices of the in-house asset rules, and therefore opens up a range of additional opportunities about how that trust can be structured to enable that property to be acquired and then ultimately maintained.
Yeah, that's right. And probably, through both of our shared experiences with fund administration, what we largely talk about there is potentially certain practices, accounting practices, medical practices, others where you have multiple unrelated parties where they invest in those trust structures, and then that trust invests back in the premises, and then income often gets distributed in through those trusts. So you have this variation as to the way they hold them, and those sorts of structures can obviously get quite complex. And so what we tend to focus more on is those that have far more specific rules for self-managed super funds, such as those 1322C that you mentioned before, to ensure that funds that are almost exclusively investing in related entities or related trusts make sure they're following all the right rules, so they don't fall foul of the legislation, which ultimately will likely result in them having to remove the asset or paying larger tax, or, in a winner takes all, both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from that point of view, some of the complexities that come about, some of the things that spring to mind for me are, LRBAs is one, and that in itself has complexities because we have an exception to the borrowing rules ordinarily, but more recent, I guess I say more recent times, but it's been around for a long time, is the non-arm's length the non-arm's length income rules as well, and how that might be structured, and how even the expenditure rules might impact and influence the non-arm's length income rules. So what are the other areas that people need to be conscious of when they think about structuring for the acquisition of property?
Yeah, well, one of the main things is ultimately the type of property that we're trying to identify, and then most significantly is the tenant associated with the property. So obviously a self-managed super fund can invest in both residential and commercial property. There is ultimately a strict provision of not being able to lease that premises out to a related party if it's residential in its nature. But if it's commercial, obviously you do have the capacity to lease it to a related party, and those rules apply whether it's directly held or indirectly held. But when we start to talk about these investments through trusts and holding, whether commercial or residential property, there's also a lot of restrictions on the inability of that trust to invest in any other assets at that time as well. And so it's really important ultimately that what you're really doing is you're putting a shell around the property so that you are unitizing the actual investment in the property rather than investing in bricks and mortar itself. So it provides some form of, I guess, for want of a better term, liquidity around that style of investment versus that direct transaction. But in itself, that also creates obviously problems along such things as non-arm's length income that you mentioned.
Yeah, and probably to finish off that, because I guess you spoke a lot about the acquisition piece there, but there are far more stringent requirements that we need to be on top of, because I think, and you did touch on this a little bit earlier, that it is quite easy to blow up that situation whereby a requirement that is contained within 13.22D is failed. There is really no avenue for recourse. We do then need to ultimately go and unwind that arrangement, which could be quite diabolical in a business situation.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is that what we need to look at when we're saying, okay, well, as a fund, we want to invest in property, right? So that's the ultimate goal of the fund. Then they have to determine, well, what's the correct way to invest, and then what are the ramifications of doing it wrong based on the way that we invest, and what restrictions are placed on us from an acquisition point based on the way that we invest. And the rules differ slightly based on both the acquisition side of things, the holding entity as such, and then the income and expenditure rules associated with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, these are just some of the areas that we'll be talking about, as we said, in our upcoming SMSF Property Masterclass. We'll take a look at, Tim, the structure of holding that property. We, of course, have in our Little Brewers Super Fund the brew house and the tap house, so the brewer and the tap house. So it provides us with scope to contemplate some of these areas and then naturally look at things like the acquisition of those assets, whether we might be relying upon our business real property exemption, as we have touched on previously, through the structure of LRBAs and much, much more. And I think what we might do, Tim, as our next topic is actually look at some of the considerations as part of a potential acquisition by the self-managed super fund in next week's Feeling Smarter. So to you, once again, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And if you'd like to find out more about our upcoming masterclass, you can visit our website, smartersmsf.com/events, and you'll find the masterclass there. We look forward to seeing you then. Take care. Bye for now.
See you later.